Hello. The title of this lecture is, What Does the President Do? One of the great ironies of the presidency is that the president is both simultaneously held to be responsible for a lot of things that are somewhat beyond the control of any one individual, and at the same time rendered completely impotent by a number of other factors. So let's start with the basics. Let's start with the Constitution, and in particular, let's start with what the framers of the Constitution had in mind when they created the presidency. The framers wanted a president, a single executive, who would be sort of the figurehead for all of the United States. And because they were very concerned about sort of not creating a king, they very specifically limited the presidential powers in some ways, wanting to make sure that wherever possible the power of the president was checked by the states and by the legislature. In the end, what they very specifically created was a president who would act on issues where there was a single voice needed that would represent the entire country. Or, if you wanted to look at it another way, they wanted to create a single voice that would sort of counterbalance the tendency otherwise to create different policies that would benefit different states. Remember, I want you to hear the echoes of the Articles of Confederation as I'm talking about this. So what specifically did they create? Well, according to the Constitution, the president has actually very few powers. First and foremost, the president is commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy, and, well, we can read into that by default the Air Force and the Marines, which were, of course, created after the Constitution was ratified. He's also commander-in-chief of the militia when it is called into U.S. service. So what this means for those of you who pay attention to this stuff is when the Pennsylvania National Guard is called up to, help with a flood within Pennsylvania, the president has no control over it. When, however, the Pennsylvania National Guard is called up to do an emergency rescue overseas, the president is commander-in-chief for the Pennsylvania National Guard in that instance. This, obviously, is an instance where there needs to be a single leader who is in charge of the armed forces who can sort of create a unitary decision-making process. The president also has very specific foreign powers. It is the president who appoints ambassadors and consuls, and it is the president who makes treaties, which, again, in the interest of checks and balances, do require two-thirds consent of the Senate. Now, it's important to sort of wonder, maybe, why the president gets to write treaties, because you might think that this would be legislative. And one of the things that sort of this highlights is the change in foreign policy in the last 250 years. When the Constitution was written, treaties were more often to be sort of military pacts, agreements to either protect other countries or not to go to war with them or to recognize each other's borders. This was more of a military thing that required a single decision maker. In contrast, today treaties tend to be more about trade policies and other types of things, which make it seem more like legislation. This is one of the reasons why writing treaties has become much more complicated recently. It's also important to realize that one of the reasons we sort of get a little bit nervous about the president's powers in making treaties and as commander-in-chief is a legacy of the War Powers Act, and in particular the Vietnam War, which occurred in the late 1960s and early 1970s. These were cases where, and there are certain parallels with today, the president had gone to war as commander-in-chief and had acted somewhat unilaterally. This became a huge drain on resources, and Congress began to protest rather vigorously that here they were required to spend budgets and do all kinds of other things, spend money, but were not being given an account of how that money was being spent, because the president, as commander-in-chief, could declare that he was taking people to war and that this was not something that the Senate or the House had any check on. This is why we have the War Powers Act. It's important to realize that the other sort of legacy of the Vietnam is that by and large we had a very long string of history after Vietnam in which there were comparatively few military interventions. And this has changed more recently, basically since about 1992, for reasons that we may discuss when we start talking about foreign policy. So, the first two things that the president is in charge of is the military forces and foreign powers. The other things that the president can do are make other appointments. This was what's referred to in the Constitution as ministers. We would probably refer to them more as secretaries of cabinet departments now. The president also appoints Supreme Court judges. Some people have argued that this may be the most important power that the president has, because especially in appointing judges, but also in appointing sort of leaders of various levels of the bureaucracy, these are the people who actually go and enforce the laws that the Senate and the House pass. And in the case of the Supreme Court, these are the people who decide whether that legislation is legal or not. Moreover, these people can also continue in their offices, especially Supreme Court justices, long after the actual president is no longer in office. For this reason, perhaps, all appointments that the president makes are subject to the consent of Congress. These people need to be voted on some level. And one of the interesting things that's happened increasingly over time is that people have accused the Senate of sort of delaying many appointments, that the president would appoint people, but that the Senate would just never get around to voting to approve of these nominations, in some cases delaying their impact for years. One of the most significant things ones of those that happened recently were some of the people that were appointed as regulators for Wall Street that the Senate, in part for philosophical reasons, just never voted on, keeping these positions vacant for over 2 years. Moreover, the president is empowered to deal with Congress. And as the Constitution says, the president will, and I quote, "from time to time give to the Congress information of the State of the Union and recommend measures." The president can also ask the Congress to convene on extraordinary occasions. This was somewhat important, and I suspect that when the writers of the Constitution were adding this, they were thinking in particular of ways in which the king had interacted with Parliament, and Parliament had interacted with the king, and sometimes the Parliament would just refuse to meet. Ironically, this is not really a problem for today's Congress. In fact, more and more we're discovering that Congress is a 24/7 job that extends many months of the year. Although it's important to sort of balance that with the fact that part of being in Congress is also going out and visiting your constituents during recesses. And so while people sometimes accuse the Congress of being very lazy because they take 3-month vacations over, the summer and so on, members of Congress would sort of say, well, they need that time so that they can go and meet with people in their own districts. Another part of this dealing with Congress thing is the State of the Union. The State of the Union address is the only speech that the president is required to give, and it's important to realize that we've had some presidents that gave regular updates, especially in the media era, where they would give speeches fairly regularly about what was going on in the country, and other presidents who were remarkably reluctant to do so. This may just be personal preference. The president is, however, required every year to give a State of the Union address. And part of the reason we can say that the president does this is to, again, counteract the potential regional outlook that Congress might have otherwise. It is the President in the State of the Union who can sort of point out issues that are affecting the country as a whole, or can tie together a problem that is happening in Maryland with a problem that is happening in Montana, and sort of make Congress aware of the fact that these are related issues that need to be addressed. Otherwise, there might be the potential that each state would be struggling with these things on their own. As part of the State of the Union, or perhaps just in other speeches, the President is allowed to recommend measures. And I use the word recommend and emphasize that, because just the Congress will not necessarily consider something just because the President recommends it. And it's important to sort of recognize what influences whether or not the presidential proposals will be followed. People who spend a lot of time studying this stuff have noticed that things that presidents propose rather early on in their term are far more likely to be passed by Congress, or at least looked at by Congress, than things that are proposed much later on. Earlier is better, people argue, for a couple of reasons. First, because when a president has just taken office, there's this sense that he has a mandate, that people had voted for this president because the president had promised to do these things. Moreover, there's an excitement for change, an excitement for new things that Congress is somewhat susceptible to. And people have argued that what happens early in a presidency is that a president has, for lack of a better term, no previous strikes against him. There isn't this sense that the president had already failed to fulfill some other promise that he had made. There's this excitement that these are new things and that perhaps this new presidential term will get along better than the old one did. The worst thing in the world to be, if you are a president and trying to make suggestions and proposals to Congress, is a lame duck. And a lame duck is a reference to a president who is at the end of his term and will not be returning. So a president who's either being voted out of office, so November, December of their last year in office, or else a president who has served 2 terms. And in that case, the lame duck period will probably set in even much earlier. A lame duck, the phrase lame duck, for those of you who don't know it, it refers to an actual duck. And they sort of say, well, what's worse than a lame duck? They say, a lame duck can't walk. A lame duck can't really swim. The only thing the lame duck can do is fly away. A lame duck president can propose things, but doesn't really have much power or influence, isn't really viewed as being the head of the political party, isn't really viewed as having much of a say. Voters have sort of gotten tired of that person. The only thing a lame duck president can do is sort of propose things and then fly away. One of the other things that influences whether presidential proposals are taken up by Congress or not is the nature of the issue. Whether that issue that the president has proposed is foreign or domestic. Especially in times past, there was a sense that, and I quote, "politics stops at the water's edge." The idea was that strong leadership was needed for international crises, and that U.S. national foreign policy should be sort of a united thing, not characterized by bickering among parties. This has ceased to be the case to some extent, or at the very least it's waning, which is another sort of interesting trend to sort of be aware of in American politics. However, there is still in some areas that still holds true. For example, those of you who've sort of been aware of the current military engagements in the United States will be aware that people sort of had this united front, and have had this united front for all the 10 years that we've been at war, where they sort of said, well, regardless of what you think of the war, we do support the troops coming back, and we do support sort of, the soldiers who are being deployed. The idea being that, even if you didn't like the war, you shouldn't necessarily be bickering about or fighting over people coming back. The third thing that affects whether or not a presidential proposal will be taken up by Congress is which party controls the Congress. If the president and the majority of Congress are of the same party, things are much more likely to be taken up. Although, again, this is not ironclad. It helps a lot if a presidential proposal is part of that party's platform, part of that uniform set of ideas and proposals that the party generates, as opposed to something that's just, a president's idea that he came up with. Moreover, its political party will be more likely to sort of act on that if it had been a campaign issue, if it had been something that the president or some member of Congress had been talking about while they were out looking for votes. That is pretty much all that a president can do. He can command the Army and the Navy. He can sort of deal with foreign affairs where he represents the national government or the entire United States. He can make a few appointments, and he can make speeches and suggest ideas. What the president cannot do is a lot of the nitty-gritty stuff that we tend to sort of put onto the shoulders of the president. You'll note that a president can propose all he wants. It does not mean that Congress will act. And moreover, it does not necessarily mean that any of the things that he proposes will be enacted in the way he proposes them. Finally, a lot of the things that sort of you will see and hear about in the presidential campaign are somewhat beyond the control of the president. The economy is a big one that usually gets laid at the feet of a president, and it's somewhat interesting. They've done all kinds of studies which have sort of shown how the economy will definitely influence who people vote for president. But the economy is a rather complex thing. Something as simple as gas prices right now are the effect of global markets, and the president is not really capable single-handedly of changing them. This is one of the ironies of politics, is that the offices that people hold are often somewhat more limited than the way they portray them when they're out campaigning. I hope you've gotten an idea of what the president can or cannot do. As always, I am happy to answer questions, and I hope you have a good day. Bye-bye.